explore in this chapter today. So we will talk about what is reproduction first, and then we'll talk about various things like the types of reproductions. So these are the two topics that we are going to cover, and then we'll talk about the events, which you already know, and then we'll talk about the stages in life cycle, of a living organism, right? So with respect to its reproduction cycle, right? So beginning with what exactly is reproduction. So we shall talk about the types of reproduction first, right? So reproduction is simply the way the one organism, right? So,
just a minute. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah.
I am just inform students. Ma students, everyone just change your names, ma. You need to write your school name along with your name so that we can find out which school students you are attending. Okay. So kindly rename yourself as school name comes your name. Okay. Okay, sir. You can just start the session. The
Okay.
student would change their names.
Sure. So coming to the reproduction, so reproduction is all about reproducing a replica. So if there is one living organism, right, let us say this block is a living organism, and how is this living organism going to produce a similar offspring, right? A similar offspring is reproduction, right? And the process by which it produces its replica could be different depending upon uh, the type of organism or the species it belongs to and all, right? But it is same for all the living organisms, right, which undergo reproduction. And coming to the types of asexual reproduction, so first of all, let us define what is asexual reproduction. Asexual, the name itself indicates sex, which means A refers to absent, sex refers to male or female. So simply irrespective to gender, right? So there is no gender, something that is involved in asexual reproduction. So generally organisms reproduce without any gamete production, and the asexual reproduction products, right, the offsprings that are produced by asexual reproduction usually are identical to parents. Why? Because there is nothing called variations that are involved, so the offsprings will be identical to the parents, right? And mostly mitosis is the type of cell division that helps in asexual reproduction. And again, no variations are introduced, and when there is no variations, this do not contribute much to evolution. All right, so now let us talk about the different types of asexual reproduction. So asexual reproduction throughout the plant kingdom and throughout the animal kingdom, right, or throughout the living organisms, there are various types of asexual reproductions that are followed. Of those, some of the important ones we are going to discuss are fission, budding, regeneration, and spore formation, and fragmentation and vegetative propagation. So let's go with fission first, right? So fission, as we have already discuss this, right? So amoeba is a best example for fission, right? So amoeba, it undergoes a karyokinesis first, right? That is the nuclear division. And this nuclear division is followed by splitting of cell. And this splitting of cell into two identical daughter cells. Identical daughter cells is called binary fission. Is called binary fission. So this is something where a single amoeba, right, finally divides into two cells of identical daughter cells, right? And these are more or less of equal size and similar genome composition. Similar genome composition, right? So there are certain other organisms, right? So where you see this is the living organism and lot of karyokinesis events takes place. So several karyokinesis events takes place and all these are packed in nice plasma membranes. And now after these many cells are produced, the major cell or the bigger cell, the mother cell will rupture to release all the other daughter cells. So this is an example of your multiple fission. So multiple fission is something which you see in certain members of protozoans. So we can take example of the sporozoans, which is your Plasmodium species. And talking about the types of fission, we can also mention about these uh, the type of fission that is asymmetric, transverse, longitudinal, depending upon the plane of division, right? Asymmetric amoeba we can take, right? So there is no proper symmetry and they just divide. Transverse we can talk about paramecium, and longitudinal we can talk about euglena. So these are some examples of fission, right? And now let us go for the next, that is budding. Talking about budding, budding and fission are more or less similar, but in case of fission, you do not see the parent cell, leftovers of parent cell. There is no leftover of parent cell. It is just that they undergo rejuvenation, right, by splitting into two equal daughter cells. Whereas in case of budding, right, the karyokinesis takes place and then there is a small bud that is formed which just pinches off from the parent body, and now you see a parent cell like this and a new bud. So this is something which is commonly seen throughout the yeast members, right? So the Saccharomyces members. So yeast comes in several other occasions also. We have to recall those. It is a unicellular fungi. It is important in alcohol production, industrial alcohol production, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It is also called as, the Saccharomyces cerevisiae is also called as baker's yeast or brewer's yeast. These are the different attributes to yeast, right? And this is about the budding, right? You have something called exogenous budding and exogenous budding and endogenous budding. So let us go for other examples. Uh, for yeast, we can consider it as unicellular exogenous budding, right? So let us go for another example. There is some coelenterate, which looks like this. Hope you all know this, which is a hydra. And this hydra produces a daughter bud which pinches off from the parent body and develops into a new daughter cell, new daughter organism, right? So this here is a multicellular exogenous budding. And you also have certain other examples. Say for example, your members of Porifera, which generally produces gemme, right? The sporing bodies where there are the spores that are packed in a vesicle like this, which go to a new place and start forming a new sponge. So these are some examples of endogenous budding. We can look at the image. So here is it. This is hydra, and these are the gemme that I spoke about in poriferans. We can also quote some examples from fungi. So of course this will be a more apt example if we talk about sporogenesis. So there also we talk about exogenous and endogenous, right? So the sporogenous are someone which produces spores. Fungi and algae stands as a best example. And here we have something called motile spores and non-motile ones. The motile spores include your zoospores, and non-motile ones include your sporangiospores or simply aplanospores. So here also we can make a classification of endogenous spores and exogenous spores. Endogenous are something which are produced inside a sac called sporangium, whereas exogenous are not produced inside the sac, rather they are released outside, right? So say for example, let us take the member of uh, Phycomycetes, or let us take an example of a basic any other fungi, a normal fungi. So if this is the hypha and there is a fruiting body that is formed like this, in which there are several spores that are enclosed, and once this sporangium, the sac in which spores are placed, is filled, then this sporangium gets ruptured and finally leads to, so let us say the sporangium is undergoing rupture and releasing all these spores, and this spore falls somewhere and produces the new mycelium like this. So this is an example of endogenous spores. So the endogenous spores, we can take example of zoospores, aplanospores of Phycomycetes members, whereas exogenous spores, we can take example of conidia. So conidia are the special exogenous spores produced in members of Deuteromycetes as well as Ascomycetes, where there are some special spore producing bodies called conidiophores, on which the spores are produced exogenously. So this is about exogenous spore formation and endogenous spore formation, uh, parallelly discussed with budding, exogenous and endogenous budding. And there are other examples of asexual reproduction too, which we can talk with respect to fungi or algae. Let us talk about this member, the famous member in algae, right? So which has this spiral chloroplast, and the name of this fellow is also named after this character. Hope you all recalled its name. It's none other than your Spirogyra. So Spirogyra is named because of its spiral chloroplast, and it is a good example that we can quote for fragmentation. So what is fragmentation? Fragmentation is quite simple. This is the filament of Spirogyra, and say for example if this filament breaks, and that filament can now form two individual organisms. So that's how fragmentation works. We can also quote some other examples of animals which have regeneration capacity. So say for example a planarial worm, right, a flatworm. So this planaria worm, if you just cut it, because of its special cells called mesenchyme, it can produce the missed organs, and that's how it reproduces by a process called regeneration. This regeneration capacity is present in certain reptiles also, but it is not a complete regeneration capacity, right? It is just partial, where they can bring out or grow some missed organs like tail or limbs. And if we talk more about asexual reproduction, let us talk about this good example of vegetative propagation. So what is vegetative propagation? Vegetative propagation is a type of reproduction where offsprings are produced with the help of vegetative parts of the plant, which are mentioned as vegetative propagules. And these vegetative propagules can be a derivative of stem or a derivative of leaf or anything. So now let's talk about some famous examples which are given in our book, as well as which are discussed in morphology of flowering plants. So the subaerial stem modifications. Subaerial stem modifications like runners, stolons, suckers, and offsets. So these all are something which are involved in vegetative propagation. Runners, we took example of some oxalis, etc. Offsets, we took examples of pistia and eichhornia, the water hyacinth. Eichhornia is the well-known example in several occasions. We talk about BOD of lakes in ecosystem, right, which is reduced because of eichhornia. We also talk about eichhornia in certain other occasions where it came as a contaminant in wheat. Sorry, this is which came for which was introduced to India for its beautiful shape of leaf and flowers, which is otherwise called as terror of Bengal. So these are some other attributes of eichhornia, and one more good attribute is offset, which helps the eichhornia to just flourish on throughout the lakes or whatever, right? Next, there are some stem modifications, the aerial stem modifications like bulbil. So bulbils are vegetative propagules in cycles, and we can also quote oxalis. Oxalis is another example where uh, bulbils are helpful in vegetative propagation. Nolcol is another example, and that's about aerial stem modifications. And in case of underground stem modifications, in underground stem modification, where we spoke about these uh, rhizome, corm, bulb, and tuberous root, tuberous stem, right? In all these four, there is common thing between among these fellows. That is, first they help in storage, and second they help in vegetative propagation. They help in storage first, and then they also help in vegetative propagation. So we can quote examples of eye of a potato. We can talk about nodes on rhizome and daughter corms, daughter corm in colocasia. So these are some examples. And here there is a good example called reproductive leaves, that is bryophyllum, where the leaf buds, each and every leaf buds along the margin, along the leaf margin can produce an offspring, right? So these are examples of adventitious buds, because these buds, unlike on stem, they are arising from leaf, so hence adventitious buds. So this is all about asexual reproduction. So now let us talk about the sexual reproduction. And before introducing ourselves to sexual reproduction, let us talk about the stages in life cycle, right? So right after birth, there is a phase where the organism develops, grows and develops, which phase is called as juvenile phase, or in plants we address it as vegetative phase. And once the juvenile phase is over, right? So once the ability to produce gametes, ability to produce gametes is attained, that stage is called as reproductive phase or reproductive stage. And this do not go for continuously, it will end, right? It has some expiry date. And after that, after this reproductive capacity is lost, the senescence phase begins, right? The senescence phase refers to all the degradatory, right, or all the processes taking place, right, which are not a building process, which are completely breaking processes, right? So this is attained during old age. So these are the three phases: juvenile phase, reproductive phase, and senescence phase. And in certain plants where there is single flowering in their lifetime, which are called monocarpic flowers, so there is no problem. There is one juvenile, one reproductive, and one senescence. But there are several plants which are polycarpic, in which there are several reproductive cycles or several flowering phases. So in such plants, each flowering stage is separated by a vegetative phase. So this is about different phases. And coming to the animals, also we can classify into two types: the seasonal breeders and continuous breeders. Continuous breeders, we can take example of human beings, right, where every month there is a cycle, which is the menstrual cycle that is operated, right? And they are called continuous breeders because they can reproduce throughout the year. The seasonal breeders, we can talk about certain migratory birds. We can talk about certain members which are in wild, right? That generally shows seasonal cycles, right? Again, these seasonal cycles are because of something which is related to photoperiodism. In animals, the pigments that are present, right, which generally help them to find out the relative day length versus night length, and thus the cycles are operated, the reproductive cycles are operated, and thus they are brought into the heat period where they can perform reproduction. And that's why you see certain animals do reproduce often in particular months of a year, not throughout the year. So this is true for certain animals which are showing estrous cycle, which are in wild, especially uh, keeping aside our commercially exploited varieties like poultry members and our cattle, which generally on hormonal induction reproduce throughout the year. The other ones which are in wild are seasonal breeders. So this is about seasonal breeders, and this is about the what do you call it? There's phases of life cycle. And now let us talk about something else here. We shall talk about the sexuality of living organisms depending upon their type of gametes produced. So with respect to plants, we talk about unisexual flowers and bisexual flowers. With respect to animals, we talk about something like monoecious and dioecious, right? The unisexual and bisexual. So let us bring in the known example for us, the cockroach. So the cockroach, if you remember, the cockroach, there are the male and female are different. So here the male and female are separate. So which is sexes are separate. So under such conditions, what do you call it as? You call such condition as dioecious condition. Dioecious condition. And let us take another example, the same example from same chapter, earthworm. Earthworm is something in which male and female reproductive organs are in same organism, right? So where the sexes are not separate. So under such conditions, what do you call it as? You call it as monoecious. So here you can call them as unisexual, they, and here you call them as bisexual. And if we talk about flowers also, right? So let us take an example of a flower in which you have calyx, corolla, stamens, and stigma. So here this is a bisexual flower which has both andrecium and gynoecium, so often represented with this symbol. And now let us take another example. There is a flower, right, with only stamens in it, no stigma, no style, no pistil. So these flowers are called as staminate flowers. And there are other flowers in which there is only pistil, which is simply called as pistillate flower. So both the flowers are unisexual flowers. So this is a male flower, staminate flower, and this is a female flower. And coming to other other things with respect to these uh, algae and fungi, right? Depending upon the type of spores they produce, we call them as heterosporous and homosporous species. So yeah, we have one example here. So this image, I think this image you might have recognized this. So this is Cara. So Cara is an algae, right? So it's a member of your chlorophyceae, the green algae, and this has this antheridium and archegonium are on the same plant. So this is kind of monoecious, right? So monoecious are generally called as homosporous. whereas heterosporous species are something which produces two different types of spores. The one which is called megaspore, the one which is called as microspore. This develops into a male gametophyte and this develops into a female gametophyte. So we can take example of the members which appear like this. Marchantia, we call it as the liverworts, is an example of heterosporous species. So this is about sexuality in living organisms. So now let us move on to the reproductive events. So reproductive events are classified into three: the pre-fertilization events, fertilization, and post-fertilization events. So throughout the life cycle, there is this particular event where the sperm meets the egg, right? And we know that the gametes are haploid, and now these fellows fuse to give rise to a diploid cell called zygote. And now this zygote, what is it going to do? Are nothing but the post-fertilization events. And how are these gametes formed and how are they brought together are pre-fertilization events. So yes, the pre-fertilization events include gametogenesis, gamete transfer. Obviously the syngamy is fertilization, the fusion of gametes, and post-fertilization includes zygote formation and followed by embryogenesis depending upon the class of the living organism, right? So we have to talk about the important thing about sexual reproduction, the special types of cell division called as meiosis. So meiosis is very important in sexual reproduction, and this meiosis is of different types: the gametic meiosis, the sporic meiosis, and zygotic meiosis. But before talking about the types, let us talk about what exactly meiosis is. Meiosis is a special type of cell division in which a parent cell undergoes cell cycle, and as a result it gives four haploid cells. A diploid cell undergoes meiosis to give four haploid cells, and all these four cells that are brought up by meiosis will be different from each other because of certain processes taking place. The variations that are introduced in a cell are because of two things that takes place during meiosis. One is crossing over, and two is independent assortment. Independent assortment. We have studied about independent assortment in genetics, right? Where one pair of uh, allele will segregate irrespective of the other pair of allele, right? Where that's why we saw capital Y forming can go with capital R or small r, and that's how we saw these many gametes formed in uh, double the dihybrid cross. So yeah, independent assortment is, so anyone can go with any other form of allele, whether it be dominant or recessive, it doesn't matter, everything happens randomly. So these two events are those events which are responsible for so-called variations that are involved or that are introduced during sexual reproduction, that is during meiosis. And obviously here is a table which is showing some numbers, right? So human beings, a diploid cell has 46 and a haploid cell, that is the gametes, right? The gametes in a sperm or egg will have 23. So you please try to remember some good examples here. The common examples which we talk about, the rat maybe, or maize or rice. So which are often used in several occasions. Onion, in practicals you use that. So yeah, so please try to remember some examples here. But here, more than remembering the example, the logic of remembering the ploidy and the number of chromosomes is quite important. Fine. So now the types of meiosis. So in certain fellows like fungi and algae, you see zygotic meiosis, where the zygote undergoes meiosis and establishes spores which develop into new fungi and algae. In plants, you see sporic meiosis, where the megaspore mother cell and pollen mother cell, where the megaspore mother cell and pollen mother cell gives rise to microspores and megaspores that develop into embryo sac and pollen grains. And then there is something called gametic meiosis, where sperm mother cell and egg mother cell will undergo meiosis and directly produces a gamete. So these are different types of meiosis. And now let us talk about the events, the gamete transfer. So in gamete transfer, you often see male gametes are produced more in numbers, and this is because the transfer lead to loss of male gametes, and to increase chances of fertilization, the male gametes are produced in higher numbers. So that's about gamete transfer, and often medium is necessary. So in case of algae, bryophytes, pteridophytes, water is compulsory for fertilization, and that's why we haven't seen algae, bryophytes and pteridophytes in other than damp areas. We always have seen them only in damp areas, uh, and that's what limited their distribution, whereas angiosperms and gymnosperms, which do not require water for their fertilization, have flourished. And syngamy is about fusion of gametes, the fertilization event, and this fusion of gamete is of various types depending upon the similarity of gametes. Isogamy and isogamy. Isogamy is similar. When two similar gametes are brought together, then you call it as isogamy. And when two dissimilar ones, you call it as anisogamy. And depending upon other things like the size of egg, you have something called oogamous. Your humans have oogamous, where the large uh, egg is fertilized by a small sperm, the small male gamete. There is something called pseudogamous also. Pseudogamous is when the gametes, one of the gametes are motile and leads to fertilization. And there is something else here, the offsprings, production of offsprings without fertilization, without fertilization, which is called as parthenogenesis, which is called as parthenogenesis. So parthenogenesis is a process in which offsprings are produced without fertilization. So where the haploid cells or haploid gametes directly the egg directly develops into haploid organisms. So we can quote this good example of honeybees. The male honeybees or drones are produced by parthenogenesis without any fertilization process. And the post-fertilization events, the post-fertilization The post-fertilization events include fruit formation if it is a plant, and that too the angiosperm. We can talk about embryogenesis. So these are some of the post-fertilization events. So in case of, let us say, uh, plants, in case of plants, the ovary will give rise to pericarp, and embryogenesis is about the growth of zygote, or the zygote undergoes mitosis and gives rise to a multicellular structure that is capable of developing into a living organism, right? So which is nothing but embryo. And there are further changes. So let us talk about few changes in certain animals. So after fertilization, you see certain group of animals laying eggs. So those that generally lay eggs are called as oviparous. So here we can talk about amphibians, reptiles, aves. So during evolution, there is something which changed the fate of organisms, and one of such such things which changed the fate of organisms from being aquatic to terrestrial is this egg laying character, and especially the calcareous shells around the eggs, which made the reptiles and aves to take the terrestrial living more successfully, is uh, an advantage for them. Whereas in case of amphibians, you do not see much of such things, right? So they do not have any such calcareous shells, and that's where they require water, right? And they couldn't come on to land for I mean, whatever, the egg laying and reproduction. And this calcareous shells will protect the eggs from various things like heat, desiccation, and all. And coming to the other group, the viviparous. So viviparous are some fellows which directly produces offspring without any, I mean, there is nothing called egg or whatever. The offspring, they give birth to offsprings directly. And there are some fellow called ovoviviparous, right? So ovoviviparous, we can talk about sharks, where the development is similar to an egg. So the development, there will be a egg inside the body, right? And the new shark grows here. The development will be similar to oviparous development, but it is still inside the mother's body. So that's why ovoviviparous, or someone which shows two characters together, is called ovoviviparous. Good example is sharks. So this is about uh, the, the parity depending upon whether they can produce or lay eggs or whether they cannot. And there is a comparison question always. Why is that viviparous produces only little number of eggs, whereas oviparous members produces many number of eggs? And this comparison has an explanation. Oviparous members are exposed or are prone to dangers, are prone to environmental changes. First thing, predators, another thing. So in order to overcome these environmental changes and predators, so to increase the chance of to increase the chance of successful reproduction, they produce more number of eggs. So since viviparous fellows, the offspring is inside the mother womb, inside the mother's womb. So there is no much threat to the offspring, and mostly the viviparous fellows also shows parental care. Parental care is highest in viviparous fellows, and that's how they generally help in, that's why they generally produces less number of eggs, because they are already protected. So this is all about reproduction. So I think we have discussed or covered almost all the concepts. So the questions are often asked with respect to the examples. The type of questions asked are examples and the mode of reproduction. So say for example in vegetative propagation, what is the bud, or what is the vegetative propagule in potatoes? So it is I, right? So like that, there are some questions which are asked with respect to mode of reproduction versus examples, and again the sexuality versus examples. So this has some background, this needs a background from animal kingdom and plant kingdom also, where there are examples that are given under different porifera and all. And in every phyla you have sexes are separate or not separate, so that is important, so that they will ask you a question like this, that which of the following is not a um, dioecious one, or a or a monoecious one, and they'll give you 3 different examples which belong to other type and 1 example which is not, right? So please try to remember such examples. And some other questions related to meiosis are important here. So meiosis, the type of meiosis, or the meiosis that generally takes place in gametes or zygote. So zygotic meiosis is common in algae and fungi. So related to meiosis, there will be questions. So again, the questions can bring in the basics from cell cycle also. So they will ask you the number of chromosomes, or the number of chromatids, or the content of DNA, and they will give you some basics or data from the reproduction chapter. So those are the different questions that are often asked. And yeah, so the basics that we study here are actually important for the next 2 chapters. And from the next 2 chapters, there are several questions which are asked often. So from this lesson, we have only the basics that are to be remembered, which will be applied in the next 2 chapters. So this is all about reproduction in organisms. And now open for doubts.